The city slept under a blanket of darkness, the streets quiet except for the occasional hum of a late-night vehicle. High above, in the heart of the financial district, the glass and steel tower of Harrington Enterprises pierced the night sky, its lights gleaming like constellations fallen to earth. Within its walls, the hum of modernity contrasted sharply with the solemnity that would soon take place in the company's grand boardroom. The morning had not yet arrived, yet inside, men of power and influence were already awake, their minds sharpened by ambition, coffee, and the constant pressure of maintaining superiority. The boardroom was a cathedral of commerce. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a sprawling panorama of the city, each light below a tiny testament to human endeavor. The room itself was designed to impress. Polished mahogany surfaces reflected the soft illumination of overhead lamps, and every chair, every desk, every meticulously arranged paper suggested order, precision, and wealth. At the head of the long table sat Alexander Harrington, the embodiment of authority and pride. A man in his early 50s, he carried the poise of someone who had conquered every obstacle with intellect, cunning, and an unyielding will. His grey eyes were sharp and calculating, always observing, always judging. He had built an empire not only through talent, but through a relentless understanding of human nature. He knew when to challenge, when to reward, and most importantly, when to humiliate. As the morning meeting commenced, Alexander's voice carried across the table, rich and commanding. "Gentlemen, the quarterly projections are in. I expect you all to analyze them thoroughly. We cannot afford even the slightest lapse in judgment. Our competitors are ruthless. We must be ruthless too." The directors nodded, flipping through documents and murmuring statistics to one another. The room was tense, focused, every man immersed in the labyrinth of figures that determined the fate of thousands of employees, investors, and shareholders. This was their arena, and they ruled it with certainty. Yet even in this well-orchestrated display of power, the ordinary world occasionally intruded. A soft scrape of rubber soles against polished marble echoed from the hallway, a sound almost swallowed by the grandeur of the room. Then came the figure of Maria, carrying her bucket and cleaning supplies with quiet diligence. Her uniform was plain, her movements deliberate, almost cautious, yet in her eyes there was a calm determination that belied the simplicity of her role. She had been part of the company's ecosystem for years, tending to the floors, the desks, the air itself, ensuring a silent perfection. Her work was unnoticed, uncelebrated, but essential. She was the invisible current that kept the visible world flowing smoothly. Alexander's gaze, sharp as a hawk, fell upon her. A slow smirk spread across his face, tinged with amusement and condescension. He leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled before him. "Ah, Maria," he said, his voice carrying a mock warmth. "Here to read a document for us, I presume. If you manage it, perhaps I will consider offering you a position beyond custodial duties." Laughter erupted around the table. The directors, men whose lives had been sculpted by privilege and ego, laughed not with joy, but with the pleasure of superiority. Their eyes sparkled with derision as they watched her, imagining the absurdity of a janitor attempting to grasp the complex world of corporate strategy. Maria froze, the echo of their laughter bouncing painfully against the walls of her mind. She had known humiliation many times before, though rarely in such an environment. Her heart pounded, a drumbeat of both fear and defiance, but within her a quiet flame of resolve flickered, refusing to be snuffed out by mockery. She had lived her life accustomed to being underestimated, but the depth of her intellect had never been tested or appreciated in such a blatant, unforgiving arena. She placed her bucket down with deliberate care, the metallic clink ringing softly in the silence that followed. Her eyes, calm yet piercing, met Alexander's with unwavering focus. There was no trace of fear, only a serene confidence that seemed to radiate outward, commanding attention in a room accustomed to obedience. She began to speak, softly at first, her voice almost a whisper, yet each word carried a resonance that demanded to be heard. She switched languages seamlessly, moving from English to French, then to Spanish and Italian, pronouncing each syllable with precision and elegance. The directors leaned in, captivated in disbelief. This was not just language, it was command, intellect, and elegance fused into one. Alexander's smirk faltered. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table, his eyes wide with astonishment. This was not the timid, invisible woman he had assumed her to be. This was brilliance, raw and undeniable, disguised beneath the simplicity of a janitor's uniform. Maria's words did not merely impress, they challenged. She recited complex economic principles, referenced historical treaties, and analyzed market projections with the fluency of a scholar. Questions posed in languages foreign to everyone else were answered with clarity and authority. The room's atmosphere shifted, the air thick with tension, awe, and a subtle fear. The directors, once smug in their superiority, now sat frozen, confronted by the reality that they had grossly misjudged her. Alexander tried to speak, to reclaim his dominance, but words caught in his throat. He had always relied on appearances, on the armor of arrogance to maintain control. But Maria had pierced that armor effortlessly. The room had transformed from a boardroom of power into a stage where preconceptions were shattered, one calm, precise sentence at a time. Her intelligence radiated not from volume or force, but from quiet authority. She did not demand recognition, she merely existed, and in that existence she commanded respect. The directors began to realize the enormity of their error, the brilliance that had been right before them, overlooked because it did not announce itself with arrogance or spectacle. Alexander's mind raced. He had underestimated her in the cruelest way possible. Every laugh, every mocking glance now seemed like a dagger turned inward. The woman they had ridiculed, dismissed and laughed at, had revealed a depth of knowledge and skill that none of them had anticipated. Maria, meanwhile, continued her work. She cleaned, adjusted papers, and moved quietly through the room, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But her presence lingered, a silent force that reshaped perceptions and challenged the pride of powerful men. Alexander and his associates were left to grapple with the truth. Brilliance does not always announce itself with grandeur. Sometimes it arrives in silence, humility, and unassuming grace. By the time the first rays of the sun touched the city, the boardroom had changed irreversibly. Alexander, once confident in his infallibility, sat rigid, awash in shock, admiration, and the first stirrings of fear. His colleagues, too, had been humbled, forced to confront the reality that the world contained talents beyond their imagination, often hidden in the most unexpected forms. This was only the beginning, the true test, the coming revelation, and the dramatic reversal that would shake Alexander Harrington to his core were yet to come. The morning had promised routine, yet it had delivered something far more profound: the awakening of awareness, the dismantling of arrogance, and the quiet emergence of a force that would ultimately redefine the power dynamics in the room. The morning sun had not yet claimed the sky, and yet inside the towering glass and steel edifice of Harrington Enterprises, a storm of the mind was unfolding. Alexander Harrington, seated at the head of the massive mahogany table, felt a disquiet he had rarely known in his decades of business dominance. He had faced competitors willing to sabotage entire industries, colleagues who betrayed alliances with the casual cruelty of chess masters, and boardrooms filled with tempers sharpened like knives. Yet never had he felt this gnawing uncertainty, this strange friction in his otherwise unshakable confidence. It was caused by her, Maria. She moved silently, almost imperceptibly, yet her presence filled the room with a gravity that could not be ignored. The faint clink of her bucket against the polished floor was like a distant drumbeat, heralding a quiet revolution. She dusted, polished, and adjusted with meticulous precision, yet every motion seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. The air seemed to bend around her, charged not with spectacle, but with a quiet power that demanded recognition. Alexander's grey eyes, usually sharp and unyielding, followed her every motion with a mixture of astonishment and wariness. He leaned back in his chair, hands steepled, trying to reclaim the comfort of control, yet finding himself disarmed by the calm assurance she exuded. His mind raced through decades of experience, yet none of it prepared him for this. A janitor, dismissed and overlooked, revealing an intellect far beyond that of anyone seated at this table. The board members, still recovering from the earlier display of multilingual mastery and financial acumen, whispered among themselves. The room, once echoing with derisive laughter, now hummed with a strange reverence. Each director, regardless of their experience or influence, had been confronted with the discomforting realization that brilliance could exist where they least expected it. Victor, the youngest associate, cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, it seems extraordinary. No one, not in our years of experience, could have anticipated this." His words trembled with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Alexander's jaw tightened, his mind a storm of conflicting impulses. "Extraordinary, yes," he said slowly, each word measured, "and yet it exposes a flaw within us all. How often have we dismissed talent because it did not conform to our narrow expectations? How many opportunities have been lost to judgment clouded by appearances?" He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. His reflection was mirrored in the eyes of his colleagues, many of whom had prided themselves on discernment, yet now grappled with the unsettling truth that perception could be profoundly misleading. Maria, undisturbed by the scrutiny, continued her work with quiet dignity. She straightened papers, polished the edges of the table, and adjusted chairs with a calm, methodical rhythm. To the untrained eye, her actions were ordinary, almost routine, yet each motion reflected a mind attuned to observation, analysis, and subtle influence, a mind capable of orchestrating outcomes with precision invisible to those untrained in such awareness. Alexander leaned forward, the first flicker of vulnerability crossing his usually impenetrable demeanor. "Maria," he said, his voice steady but underscored with curiosity, "your knowledge, your insight, it is remarkable. Tell me, how have you cultivated these skills?" Maria paused, placing her hand lightly on the polished surface. Her gaze met his, calm and unflinching. "I have always sought understanding," she replied, her tone serene. "I study languages, histories, human behavior, not for recognition, not for power, but to understand the world as it is, and to act with wisdom when necessary. Knowledge is not bound by position or title, but by curiosity, discipline, and the courage to seek truth." The room fell silent. Even the youngest associates felt a shiver of respect ripple through their ranks. Alexander felt a pang in his chest. An unexpected stir of admiration mingled with fear. Here was someone who possessed not only intellect, but the humility and insight to wield it without arrogance, a combination that both inspired and unsettled him. Victor spoke again, this time with more confidence, though still tinged with awe. "It seems we have been blind, sir. We judged her based on role, attire, and station, but those things never measure potential. What we witnessed is genius, in a form we never anticipated." Alexander nodded, slowly, feeling the unfamiliar weight of humility press upon him. He had always relied on hierarchy, perception, and the subtle manipulation of appearances to maintain control. Now, confronted with Maria's quiet brilliance, he realized the fragility of such structures. Genius could not be contained by assumptions. It revealed itself only when allowed to emerge. As the morning progressed, Maria began to share insights that extended far beyond what anyone in the room expected. She analyzed financial statements with precision, predicted market fluctuations with uncanny accuracy, and articulated historical and economic concepts in multiple languages. Her observations were not only correct, but transformative, challenging the very assumptions upon which the directors had built their strategies. The boardroom, once an arena of power and control, had become a theater of revelation. The hierarchy that had defined the space dissolved under the weight of her intellect. Each sentence, each demonstration of mastery, chipped away at preconceived notions, leaving the directors to confront an uncomfortable truth. Brilliance often arrives where least expected. Alexander, for the first time in years, felt the vulnerability of uncertainty. His mind, accustomed to control, now struggled to grasp the implications of Maria's abilities. He had underestimated her, and in doing so, had glimpsed the fragility of his own dominance. The irony was not lost on him. The very person he had mocked and humiliated now stood as a mirror to his own limitations. Maria, for her part, remained serene, her actions composed and deliberate. She did not seek attention, did not demand recognition. Yet her presence, her intellect, and her quiet authority reshaped the dynamics of the room. The directors, who had once occupied positions of unquestioned power, now found themselves in awe, learning and reflecting. Hours passed. Discussions continued, flowing seamlessly between languages, analyses, and strategies. Maria's calm, unwavering presence maintained the focus and intensity of the session. Alexander, once the unquestioned master of the room, began to see her not merely as an assistant or janitor, but as a strategist, a thinker, and an advisor whose contributions had the power to influence outcomes far beyond the walls of the boardroom. By midday, the air was thick with the realization of a new reality. Alexander exhaled slowly, recognizing that the morning had irrevocably shifted the balance of perception. Maria had not merely impressed them, she had challenged the very foundation of their assumptions, revealing a truth they could no longer ignore. Talent, insight, and intelligence were often hidden beneath layers of invisibility, revealed only to those willing to look beyond appearances. And yet, even as the directors murmured in quiet acknowledgement, Maria returned to her work with the same calm dignity. She polished, she straightened, she arranged, as if the world had not shifted at all. But in truth, nothing would ever be the same. Alexander's empire, built on hierarchy and appearances, had encountered a force beyond his immediate understanding, a mind that defied expectation, a spirit that refused to be constrained. The first phase of this awakening was complete. Alexander knew, with a growing sense of both anticipation and apprehension, that Maria's abilities were only beginning to reveal themselves. The coming days, the unfolding interactions, and the ultimate revelation of her full potential promised a reordering of influence, authority, and perhaps even destiny itself. In that quiet, sunlit boardroom, the lines between service and leadership, between visibility and influence, began to blur. Maria's intelligence, patience, and discipline had begun to carve a path toward a future no one had foreseen. A future in which the overlooked, the underestimated, and the quiet could hold power equal to, or perhaps greater than, those who had once wielded it unchallenged. Alexander, seated at the head of the table, stared out the window at the city below, feeling the unfamiliar stirrings of both awe and fear. He had laughed, mocked, and dismissed, yet now he understood that the greatest lessons often arrive in silence, and that the most extraordinary forces may be hidden in plain sight. And somewhere within him, a seed of recognition began to grow, the realization that Maria was not just a janitor, not just a clerk, but a mind capable of altering the very course of his world. And that alteration, when it fully manifested, would be nothing short of revolutionary. The morning hours stretched into an intricate web of observation, dialogue, and silent reflection, each second charged with the weight of revelations that no one in the boardroom had anticipated. Alexander Harrington, once supremely confident in his mastery over the empire he had built, found himself ensnared in a paradox. He was simultaneously the architect of this corporate machine and a spectator powerless to ignore the force that Maria represented. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the gleaming mahogany table, fingers steepled as his mind raced. Every decision, every past assumption about talent, leadership and influence now seemed provisional, fragile, subject to reconsideration. The laughter from earlier, that cruel echo of his condescension toward Maria, haunted him. He had assumed without hesitation that her presence was inconsequential, that her role was limited to routine service. And yet, in the span of a single morning, she had unraveled these assumptions with an effortless grace that made his own carefully constructed authority feel tenuous. The directors, too, were caught in the grip of this new reality. They whispered in subdued tones, exchanging glances that spoke of awe, insecurity, and a dawning recognition of a talent that defied categorization. None of them had ever encountered a person who combined analytical brilliance, linguistic mastery, and emotional intelligence so seamlessly. Their years of experience, their carefully curated strategies, felt suddenly inadequate when measured against Maria's quiet command of the room. Victor, the youngest among them, cleared his throat once more, the tremor in his voice betraying both admiration and a hint of fear. "Sir," he said, glancing nervously at Alexander, I've never seen anything like this. Her analysis is precise, her understanding profound. It's as if she can perceive the underlying patterns that elude even our most experienced minds." Alexander nodded, but his mind was elsewhere, probing deeper. He watched as Maria moved gracefully through the room, her hands arranging papers, adjusting chairs, occasionally glancing at a document or screen with a concentration that bordered on reverence. Every motion was deliberate, purposeful, and yet subtle, a choreography of competence that spoke louder than words. How, he wondered internally, did I fail to notice this sooner? How many other individuals have I overlooked, dismissed because of their attire, their station, or my own arrogance? The question gnawed at him with relentless intensity. Alexander prided himself on his discernment, his ability to assess talent, to predict outcomes, and to navigate the treacherous waters of business with unerring skill. Yet here he was, confronted by a woman whose abilities transcended his expectations and whose humility magnified her power. Maria paused for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. She looked around the room, her calm gaze meeting Alexander's with quiet authority. "Knowledge," she said softly, "is not a privilege of position or title. It is cultivated, nurtured, and applied with intention. True competence does not announce itself with arrogance. It reveals itself through action and understanding." Her words, simple yet profound, resonated through the room. The directors felt their own assumptions challenged, their sense of superiority quietly dismantled. Alexander, normally unshakable, felt a stir of humility that was both disconcerting and illuminating. He realized that brilliance had a quiet, commanding power, one that did not rely on spectacle, but on substance. Charles, one of the senior directors, spoke for the first time in several hours, his voice tinged with awe. "Sir, it is not merely her knowledge that astonishes, but her comprehension of human behavior, her ability to navigate subtle dynamics. She is extraordinary." Alexander nodded, slowly. He recognized the truth in Charles's observation. Maria's intelligence was multifaceted, analytical, strategic, linguistic, and emotional. She was not merely competent, she was transformative, capable of reshaping the very framework of their operations without ever demanding recognition. As the morning progressed, Maria began to interweave her observations into the ongoing discussions. She highlighted overlooked opportunities, identified latent risks, and proposed solutions with a precision that left even the most seasoned directors speechless. Her interventions were subtle, yet powerful, shaping the conversation and guiding decisions with an elegance that made coercion or assertion unnecessary. Alexander observed her closely, fascinated by the quiet mastery she exhibited. He realized that Maria's influence was not imposed, it was absorbed. She did not force authority, she inspired it. Her calm demeanor, her meticulous attention to detail, and her profound understanding of both systems and people created a presence that was impossible to ignore. Yet as admiration grew, so did tension. Some directors, unable to reconcile their shock with their egos, whispered among themselves, expressing concern that Alexander was ceding too much influence to a figure they had once dismissed. They feared disruption, the destabilization of their carefully maintained hierarchy, and the exposure of their own limitations. Each time they hesitated, Maria's calm presence reminded them, without confrontation, of the futility of resistance. She was not threatening, but undeniable. Alexander's mind wrestled with conflicting impulses. Part of him wanted to test her, to challenge her understanding, to see if her brilliance could withstand scrutiny. Another part, more wary and cautious, recognized the power she wielded through intellect and composure alone. He realized that any misstep could disrupt not only his authority, but the cohesion of the entire boardroom. And so he spoke. Carefully, his tone measured. "Maria," he said, "your insights are invaluable. We must understand the full scope of your perspective. I would like you to guide us through the latest strategic projections, highlighting both opportunities and potential pitfalls. Your analysis will shape our decisions today and beyond." Maria nodded, her expression serene, yet intent. She positioned herself closer to the table, her posture composed, her eyes scanning the documents with an almost meditative focus. The directors leaned in, each one aware that they were witnessing a masterclass in intelligence and influence, delivered with quiet humility. Hours passed, each moment a testament to Maria's capabilities. She navigated complex data, articulated trends with precision, and anticipated challenges that had eluded even the most experienced directors. Her comprehension was holistic. She balanced quantitative analysis with qualitative understanding, economic insight with human intuition. The room, once a theater of arrogance and hierarchy, had become a forum of revelation, reflection, and recalibration. Alexander, seated at the head of the table, felt a rare mixture of awe and unease. He had encountered formidable intellects before, but never one that demanded recognition, not through assertiveness, but through subtle command. Maria's genius did not clash with his authority. It transcended it, gently dismantling assumptions while leaving the possibility of collaboration intact. By late morning, the boardroom had transformed completely. The directors, who had entered the room with confidence and entitlement, now listened with humility and attentiveness. Alexander understood, with growing clarity, that this morning marked not merely an encounter with exceptional talent, but the beginning of a profound shift, an awakening that would challenge entrenched hierarchies, redefine influence, and perhaps even reshape the trajectory of his empire. Maria continued her work, serene and deliberate, polishing, adjusting, and analyzing. She remained outwardly unobtrusive, yet her presence radiated an influence that was unmistakable. The company she served, the people who had once underestimated her, and even Alexander himself were now enmeshed in a subtle but undeniable transformation, a recognition that true power often lay hidden, revealed only when circumstances allowed. As the sun reached its zenith, Alexander exhaled slowly, realizing that the dynamics of the room and of the company itself had shifted irrevocably. Maria had not simply impressed them, she had recalibrated their perceptions, challenged their assumptions, and subtly asserted a power that demanded acknowledgement. The stage was set, the players realigned, and the true magnitude of her abilities remained yet to be unveiled. And within him, a quiet, unspoken anticipation began to grow. The awareness that Maria's influence, when fully realized, would not merely alter decisions or strategies, it would precipitate a transformation so profound that it would leave everyone, including Alexander himself, irrevocably changed. The late afternoon sun had begun to retreat behind the skyline of the city, casting the boardroom of Harrington Enterprises in a muted golden glow. Shadows stretched across the polished mahogany table, dancing along the walls like silent witnesses to the unfolding drama. Alexander Harrington, seated at the head of the table, felt a peculiar tension, a gnawing uncertainty that he could neither name nor dismiss. The events of the morning, followed by the afternoon's revelations, had left him oscillating between awe, apprehension, and a strange exhilaration. He watched Maria intently. She moved among the papers and chairs with quiet grace, her every motion deliberate, yet understated. To anyone else, she appeared to be performing her janitorial duties. But Alexander, having witnessed her mastery of languages, financial acumen, and strategic insight, knew better. Every small gesture carried precision, intent, and subtle influence, an orchestration of authority that did not demand recognition but commanded it all the same. He recognized the dilemma immediately. She had no formal title, no position of power, yet her presence was reshaping the hierarchy of the room. It was a power that could not be confronted head-on, only understood, anticipated, and perhaps, if he was shrewd enough, harnessed. Alexander's fingers tapped against the edge of the table in a slow, methodical rhythm, betraying a mind in overdrive. He needed to understand the extent of her capabilities, to test the boundaries of her knowledge and strategic thinking, without appearing condescending. But even as he formulated his approach, he sensed that any attempt to corner her would likely be anticipated, subtly redirected, and elegantly neutralized. "Maria," he said finally, his voice even but deliberate, "we are considering a series of acquisitions that could define the future of this company. I want you to evaluate the potential outcomes, not only the opportunities but also the risks. Consider financial, legal, and human factors. How would you proceed?" Maria paused, her gaze steady and unflinching. "Before assessing outcomes," she replied, her tone calm, "it is essential to identify and question all assumptions. Any analysis based on unexamined premises is incomplete. What are the parameters you are working under?" Alexander hesitated for only a moment, impressed by her methodical approach. "We are assuming moderate market growth, stable regulatory conditions, and limited competition interference," he said. Maria's eyes flickered to the documents laid out on the table. Her mind absorbed every detail with an almost meditative focus. "Then we must expand the scope," she began. "Consumer behavior trends, potential political or economic shifts, competitor strategies, and hidden contractual clauses must all be incorporated. Contingencies should be prepared for each scenario, ensuring the company can pivot swiftly if assumptions fail." Her response, calm yet precise, carried the weight of authority. Alexander leaned back, studying her, weighing the implications of her insight. Every word, every suggestion, subtly shifted the perception of power within the room. The directors, who had come in with confidence and entitlement, now listened with growing awareness and unease. Victor whispered to Charles, almost incredulously, "She's not just responding. She's anticipating everything we haven't even thought of yet. How is this possible?" Charles shook his head slightly, his respect tempered with anxiety. "It's unsettling, but remarkable. She sees the system as a whole, not just the pieces we focus on." Alexander recognized the truth in their murmured astonishment. Maria's intelligence was not simply analytical, it was systemic, intuitive, and profoundly strategic. She did not dominate through voice or title, but through comprehension and foresight. Her influence was subtle, yet absolute. Determined to challenge her further, Alexander refined his approach. What if market conditions diverge from expectations? If unforeseen variables appear, how would you mitigate their impact while maintaining the acquisition's objectives? Maria considered this. her expression calm, her composure unwavering. "Flexibility and preparedness are essential," she replied. "We must establish monitoring mechanisms to detect deviations early, develop adaptive strategies for multiple contingencies, and ensure that all actions remain aligned with the overarching goals. Success depends on anticipation, not reaction, and preparedness, not assumption." The directors were silent, absorbing her words. Alexander felt a mixture of awe and unease. Every test he devised was met with precision and foresight. She anticipated challenges before they were even articulated, her mind operating several steps ahead, weaving possibilities into practical strategies. The room had become a theater of subtle power plays. Directors who had once prided themselves on authority now felt their influence quietly eroding, supplanted by the intellectual gravity Maria exuded. Alexander understood the psychological reality. She was not merely competent, she was transformative. She did not seek credit, yet she reshaped outcomes, perceptions, and the flow of decision-making. Hours stretched on. The meeting evolved into a complex interplay of dialogue, observation, and reflection. Maria guided the discussion with impeccable skill, revealing overlooked opportunities, identifying potential risks, and proposing solutions that were both innovative and pragmatic. She managed to redirect skepticism without confrontation, inspire recognition without demanding it, and assert influence without authority. Alexander's mind oscillated between admiration and apprehension. He realized that Maria's power lay not only in intellect, but in emotional intelligence, psychological acuity, and strategic subtlety. She could reshape the room, influence decisions, and command attention, all without confrontation or ego. It was brilliance in its purest, most unassuming form. By mid-afternoon, Alexander decided to push the boundaries further. He introduced a hypothetical scenario, one designed to test creativity, improvisation, and foresight under pressure. The board members watched closely, anticipating hesitation or error. Maria responded without pause, analyzing the scenario from multiple angles, integrating variables that no one had considered, and articulating a strategy that accounted for both immediate consequences and long-term ramifications. Every director present felt the impact. The hypothetical challenge was not only solved, but elevated into a comprehensive plan that redefined their understanding of strategic thinking. The subtle siege of authority was complete. Alexander felt the full weight of the realization. The woman he had once mocked, the janitor who had entered the boardroom silently in the morning, was now the fulcrum around which perception, influence, and strategy pivoted. Even as admiration and respect grew among the directors, a quiet tension lingered. Some grappled with unease, realizing that traditional hierarchies and assumptions had been dismantled. Others felt inspired, recognizing the transformative potential of Maria's insight. And Alexander, seated at the head of the table, recognized that he was witnessing the birth of a profound shift, one that would not merely alter decisions or strategies, but the very structure of influence and expectation within his company. The sun sank lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the room. Alexander exhaled, a mixture of tension, awe, and anticipation stirring within him. He had tested, challenged, and observed. He had attempted to gauge limits, to find weakness. But Maria's brilliance, calm and subtle authority had remained absolute. The stage was set for a transformation of staggering consequence, a redefinition of what was possible, and the unfolding of the twist that would leave everyone, including Alexander himself, irrevocably astonished. As the shadows lengthened and the city lights began to twinkle outside, a silent understanding settled over the room. Maria's influence had transcended titles, roles, and assumptions. She was no longer merely a janitor or an observer. She was a quiet architect of outcomes, a master strategist in plain sight, and the harbinger of a revelation that none could yet fully anticipate, and somewhere deep within Alexander, a flicker of both fear and anticipation stirred. The moment was coming, the one that would illuminate the full extent of her genius and force a reckoning with assumptions, pride, and expectation. The final act was approaching, and with it, the redefinition of power itself. The city outside had begun to dissolve into night, a constellation of lights flickering across glass towers and narrow streets. Harrington, Enterprise's boardroom, was now cloaked in shadows, punctuated by the soft glow of desk lamps and the faint reflection of streetlights on polished surfaces. The air was thick with anticipation, a tangible tension that seemed to press against the walls and settle on every chair, every document, every flicker of movement. Alexander Harrington, once a man of unshakable composure, felt the unfamiliar stirrings of unease, mixed with reluctant admiration. Today had become a turning point, though he did not yet fully grasp the magnitude of what was unfolding. Maria moved with the same quiet precision she had demonstrated all day. Each motion, from adjusting the placement of a document to tilting her head in contemplation, conveyed both diligence and authority. She was not commanding attention in the conventional sense, yet all eyes in the room, Alexander's included, were drawn to her. Her calm composure contrasted sharply with the subtle turbulence that had taken hold of the board members. The directors who had arrived brimming with confidence now found themselves in a state of awe and quiet uncertainty. Alexander's mind, normally a fortress of calculated strategy, was now a battlefield. He had encountered brilliant minds before, but Maria's intellect operated on multiple planes simultaneously: analytical, intuitive, psychological, and anticipatory. Every attempt he made to probe her understanding or test her insight was met not with defensiveness or error, but with elegant precision. Each response she offered, each observation she made, seemed to anticipate not only the question, but the deeper implications of its assumptions. "Maria," Alexander said carefully, his tone even yet deliberately probing, "we face a complex scenario. Competitors are acting unpredictably, market indicators are fluctuating, and internal stakeholders are divided on strategy. I need your assessment, not just solutions, but an evaluation of potential outcomes under multiple contingencies. How would you advise us to proceed?" Maria's gaze swept across the room, briefly meeting Alexander's. Her calm eyes betrayed nothing, yet conveyed absolute awareness. "Before addressing potential outcomes," she began, "we must first define the framework of assumptions and biases that inform our understanding. Decisions made on incomplete premises are inherently fragile. To proceed, all variables must be acknowledged, measured, and anticipated." Her words struck like precision-engineered instruments, dissecting the very foundations of thought in the room. Alexander leaned forward, momentarily stunned, recognizing that this was no ordinary insight. It was systemic mastery. Maria was dismantling assumptions not through confrontation, but by exposing their incompleteness and guiding the board toward clarity. The directors murmured among themselves, a mixture of astonishment and unease rippling through the room. Victor, who had been quietly observing for hours, whispered to Charles, "It's remarkable. She's not only solving problems, she's redefining the entire framework of how we perceive them." Charles nodded slowly, unease and admiration mingling in his expression. "And she does it with humility. That's what makes it so disarming, so powerful." Alexander recognized the truth in their comments. Maria's influence was profound, precisely because it was understated. She did not assert herself through hierarchy or volume. She guided, illuminated, and orchestrated outcomes subtly, yet with undeniable effectiveness. Every insight she provided reshaped the board's understanding, recalibrating both strategy and perception. Seeking to push the boundaries further, Alexander introduced a scenario of unparalleled complexity: A multifaceted acquisition intersected with volatile market conditions, potential legal entanglements, and unpredictable competitor behavior. He framed it with layers of ambiguity, anticipating hesitation or error, yet Maria absorbed the challenge effortlessly. Her response was methodical, yet visionary. She dissected each element, revealing hidden patterns, predicting subtle interactions, and proposing adaptive strategies that accounted for variables none of the directors had considered. Every contingency was addressed, every risk mitigated, and every potential outcome evaluated with clarity that left the room breathless. The board members, who had once been confident in their own mastery, were now witnesses to a level of intellect and strategic foresight that surpassed all prior experience. Whispers of admiration mingled with quiet anxiety. Some felt inspired, others unsettled, but all recognized that the landscape of authority and influence had irrevocably shifted. Alexander's internal struggle intensified. He had built empires, led negotiations with ruthless precision, and commanded respect across continents. Yet here was a woman, appearing at first glance as a simple janitor, demonstrating a mastery that challenged every assumption he had ever held. Each answer she provided, each observation she made, chipped away at his certainty, forcing him to confront the humility he had long avoided. Hours passed, and the room became a theater of contemplation, strategic dialogue, and subtle psychological tension. Maria navigated complex discussions with grace, her presence transforming them into a cohesive flow of insight and clarity. She identified overlooked opportunities, uncovered latent risks, and wove solutions that were as elegant as they were effective. Even Alexander's carefully constructed challenges were absorbed and countered with foresight that left him both astonished and contemplative. By late evening, the room had settled into a rhythm that reflected Maria's quiet authority. Alexander, seated at the head of the table, felt the weight of realization pressing upon him. The woman he had once dismissed, the janitor who had entered silently in the morning, was now the axis around which perception, strategy, and influence revolved. She was not merely competent, she was transformative. Yet even as this understanding settled over him, a subtle tension lingered, unspoken but omnipresent. Alexander sensed that Maria's influence was not fully revealed, that she held capacities, insights, and skills that remained concealed, waiting for the precise moment to surface. Something was approaching, a shift so profound it could redefine not just the outcomes of decisions, but the very hierarchy, power dynamics, and expectations of the company. Alexander studied her carefully, noting every subtle gesture, every flicker of expression, every deliberate movement. He realized that today had been only a prelude. Maria's true capabilities, the ones that could upend assumptions, astonish the directors, and even challenge his own authority, had yet to be fully revealed. The culmination of her mastery, the moment of reckoning that would leave everyone breathless, was still on the horizon. The city outside grew darker, its lights flickering like distant stars. Inside the boardroom, the weight of anticipation hung heavy. Alexander felt a mixture of anxiety, awe, and reluctant admiration. He understood that the most consequential moment was approaching, one that would expose the full extent of Maria's brilliance, shift perceptions irrevocably, and force him and the entire board to confront realities they had never imagined. And yet, even with all he had observed, all he had tested, all he had attempted to anticipate, he knew instinctively that he had seen only a fraction of her potential. The final revelation, the true turning point, was still to come. The night was far from over, and the stage had been set for a climax that would challenge every expectation, dismantle every assumption, and leave everyone, including Alexander himself, in stunned disbelief. The room was quiet, the low hum of the city outside filtering through the large glass windows, a distant echo to the tension that had coalesced. Within Harrington Enterprises' boardroom, Alexander Harrington sat rigidly at the head of the table, his mind a whirl of calculation, anticipation, and an uneasy sense of inevitability. He had spent hours observing Maria, testing her limits, and challenging her with scenarios that had pushed even the most brilliant minds to their edge. Yet she had met every test with a precision, foresight, and calm that left him simultaneously in awe and unsettled. The directors had departed for the evening, leaving Alexander and Maria alone. The room, now dimly lit, seemed to contract around them, focusing all attention on the subtle dynamics of power, intellect, and perception that hung in the air like a palpable force. Maria, having completed her meticulous work, approached the table and laid down a folder of documents, each page detailed, annotated, and exhaustive in its insight. "Alexander," she began softly, her voice calm, yet carrying an unspoken authority, "I have prepared an analysis that addresses every variable, every contingency, and every hidden factor in the acquisition scenario you presented. It is comprehensive yet flexible, allowing for adaptive strategy as events unfold." Alexander's brow furrowed. He had seen her brilliance throughout the day, but there was something different in this moment, a deliberate unveiling, a subtle promise that the full measure of her intellect was about to be revealed. He gestured for her to continue. His curiosity mingled with an undercurrent of apprehension. She spread the documents across the table, pointing to charts, projections, and intricate frameworks. "I have identified risks that were previously overlooked, predicted competitor reactions that were not apparent, and designed contingency measures that not only mitigate potential losses, but capitalize on emerging opportunities. The acquisition can be executed with maximal advantage and minimal exposure, provided all elements are implemented with precision." Alexander leaned closer, scanning the documents with a mix of skepticism and growing amazement. Every point she made, every calculation, every strategic recommendation was flawless. Yet beneath the surface, he sensed an additional layer, an element not immediately visible, a subtle but undeniable force that extended beyond mere intellect or analysis. "Maria," he said, his voice slightly strained, "your work, it is extraordinary. But I must ask, how did you acquire such insight? How did you foresee these variables with such accuracy?" Maria's calm gaze met his, unwavering and serene. "I have devoted myself to observation, study, and practice for many years," she said. "But understanding is only part of the equation. One must also anticipate the unseen, recognize patterns beneath the surface, and interpret the intentions and behaviors of those around us. Knowledge alone is insufficient. It is the combination of perception, intuition, and disciplined reasoning that allows one to navigate complexity successfully." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. She was not merely a prodigy in intellect. She was a master of human dynamics, capable of perceiving subtleties that eluded even the most seasoned executives. The realization struck him like a bolt. The woman he had once mocked as a janitor, the one he had humiliated for amusement, was now operating on a plane far above his comprehension. "And there is one more element," Maria continued, her tone gentle yet commanding. "You may have assumed that my capabilities are limited to analysis and strategy, but I also possess linguistic fluency, cultural insight, and the ability to interpret global and local contexts simultaneously. The impact of these skills extends beyond numbers and projections. It shapes perception, influence, and decision-making at every level." Alexander's mind raced. He recalled the moment in the morning when he had mocked her in front of his board, joking that she could only sweep floors and file papers. The laughter of his colleagues, the cruel confidence in his own superiority, it all came rushing back, and now he understood the magnitude of his error. He looked at Maria, a mixture of shock, humility, and awe etched across his features. You speak how many languages?" he asked, almost whispering. 11, Maria replied simply. The room seemed to contract further as Alexander absorbed the revelation. 11 languages, an ability to communicate, negotiate, and influence. Across cultures and contexts, the implications were staggering. Every mockery, every assumption, every dismissal had been not only premature, but tragically short-sighted. The very foundation of his authority, the hierarchy he had maintained for years, now seemed fragile, even precarious. Victor and Charles had often spoken of her brilliance in hushed tones, but Alexander now understood fully. Maria was not merely talented, she was extraordinary, an unparalleled intellect, strategist, and visionary, who had been underestimated by everyone in the room, including himself. The weight of recognition settled upon him. He realized that the game had changed entirely. The woman he had dismissed as insignificant now held the power to redefine the company, its strategy, and its future trajectory. The irony was overwhelming. In attempting to test her, he had underestimated the depth of her capabilities, the breadth of her knowledge, and the subtlety of her influence. Maria closed the folder with a quiet finality, her expression calm yet resolute. "The path forward," she said, "requires only that assumptions are set aside, that preconceived notions of hierarchy and capability are suspended, and that decisions are guided by evidence, insight, and foresight. Authority is not defined by title or status. It is earned through understanding, action, and perception." Alexander exhaled slowly, the gravity of the moment pressing down on him. The realization was complete. He had been humbled, not through confrontation or failure, but through the quiet, meticulous mastery of a woman he had once ridiculed. And in that humbling, there was both shock and revelation, a profound acknowledgement of brilliance that could not be ignored. He looked at Maria, seeing her not as a janitor, not as an employee, but as a force of intellect, strategy, and subtle influence that had upended the hierarchy, reshaped perceptions, and rewritten the rules of engagement in ways he could not have anticipated. The irony, the justice, and the brilliance of it all converged in a single moment of clarity. Maria had not only proven herself, she had rewritten the narrative entirely. For the first time in decades, Alexander felt the vulnerability of his own assumptions, the fragility of his pride, and the profound necessity of humility. The woman he had dismissed, mocked, and underestimated had emerged not only victorious, but transformative, altering the trajectory of his company and his understanding of intelligence, influence, and respect forever. As night fully embraced the city, the weight of revelation settled over Harrington Enterprises. Alexander and Maria sat in silence for a moment, a quiet acknowledgement of mastery, insight, and the unanticipated reversal of fortunes. The great reversal had not only occurred, it had reshaped the very dynamics of authority, strategy, and perception within the room. And in that profound, transformative silence, Alexander understood fully. The woman he had ridiculed in the morning had, by evening, become the architect of destiny, the harbinger of insight, and the agent of a reversal so complete, so humbling, and so brilliantly executed that no one who had witnessed it would ever view the world or her with the same assumptions again.